Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. So for the last several months, the team at Criterion has been chewing on a question. It's kind of cool, actually. How do you finance a national action plan on gender-based violence? Countries write these plans, many of them. Not just developing countries, but Australia, Canada. They're serious documents, commitments, timelines. They name ministries, actions listed out, and then somebody has to pay for them. So, of course, they have budgets, but those budgets are perennially underfunded. And so one of the questions we've been wrestling with is, can we finance national action plans? But there were a bunch of pieces of how national action plans come together. Costing of gender-based violence in the country. They're mostly policy commitments, often unfunded, so how the money moves is not always clear. And so it was not easy. We pulled out frameworks that we had trusted for years, and they didn't work because they were going to explain a landscape, not read a line plan by plan. There's these things that are settings in plans, and we kept confusing them with sectors. A plan names schools and sports fields and clinics and tells you which one has to change and what has to happen, but not really where the money moves. So we did feed the whole thing magically into AI, and in early days got back something, gotta love them, polished, confident, and insanely vague. We at some point actually got really obsessed with 5 gorgeous categories for how to think about financing national action plans before we noticed that 2 of them were actually the same idea, just wearing different hats. And these are also called NAPs, National Action Plans. So every time we said it out loud, half of the room was thinking policy architecture, and the other half was thinking couch, blanket fort, do not disturb. Seriously, the universe has some jokes. So this episode comes in 2 parts. First, the distinction that kept rescuing us is that the metaphor is not the same as a mechanism. More on that. And second, the story of the frameworks that needed a nap and what we learned by letting them have one. Because sometimes progress doesn't come from the perfect framework. Sometimes it comes from finding where the framework stops and the real work begins. Enjoy, but maybe first after a brief nap. I want to pause for a second on a distinction that keeps showing up in our work on financing national action plans to end gender-based violence. It's the distinction between an investment case and an investment mechanism. And I think this matters because there's a lot of economic language around violence prevention right now. Costing studies, returns on prevention, investment cases for violence or the end of violence, arguments about what violence costs an economy and what becomes possible when prevention is funded. That work matters. I want to say that super clearly. When advocates walk into a finance ministry or a planning ministry or a cabinet meeting, they are often walking into rooms where moral urgency has not been enough. They're walking into rooms that want numbers, they want evidence, they want to know what this costs, they want to know what this saves, what it produces, what it protects. And so a costing study can do real political work. An investment case for a program can open a door. It can say this is not just a marginal issue, this is not only a social concern, it's part of the economic architecture of a country. And that's powerful. But here is where I think we also need to slow down, because an investment case is not the same thing as the underlying analysis of an actual financing mechanism. The metaphor is not the mechanism. And I do not mean that as a critique of the metaphor. I actually think that the metaphor is doing useful work. It's helping people translate violence prevention into a language that certain decision makers understand or feel sounds cool. It's making an economic case for something that should be obvious, but too often is actually not. The problem comes when we ask that metaphor to do more than it can do. So we hear versions of this all the time. We've done a costing study, we've made the investment case, and so can we bring in the private capital? And maybe, but likely not yet, and not from that sentence alone, because a projected savings number does not automatically tell us who the investor is. It doesn't tell us what they're investing in. It doesn't tell us where the revenue comes from, how risk is allocated, who the counterparty is, or what structure would actually move money from one place to another. And that's the extra translation that we absolutely have to do. We have to move from this would be good for the economy to this is an economic activity. Therefore, there are financial flows and assets. There are compliance requirements. There are institutions that can hold risk. Money can move, and this is what changes because of it. That becomes more technical, but I actually think that's a form of respect. It's a respect for the advocates who have done the hard work of getting violence prevention into economic language. It's respect for the public officials who may be trying to protect a budget line or justify a prevention strategy. And it's respect for finance itself. Because if we're going to invite investors into this work, we need to be honest about what finance can and cannot do. So for me, the question is not whether investment case language is right or wrong. The better question is, what job is it doing? Sometimes it's doing exactly the job it needs to do. It's opening a door. It's creating political permission. It's helping a ministry see prevention as part of economic planning. And sometimes when we open that door, we need an entirely different layer. We need to ask, what's the mechanism? What's the pathway? What would actually allow capital, private or public, philanthropic or commercial, to move differently because this plan exists? And that's where a framework for financing national action plans can be useful, not because it replaces the costing studies, not because it corrects the investment case, because it sits beside them and asks a different question. Not only what does the violence cost, but what would it take to finance the systems that prevent it? On our team, Nemo has this running joke that every synthesis call should come with a full nap afterwards. And I want to be clear, this is not because we're delicate flowers or intellectual lightweights. It's because every other week we get on this 2-hour call and try to figure stuff out together. Not tidy stuff, not let's update that spreadsheet stuff, the messy stuff, the wait, what do we actually mean by finance here stuff? Is it an investment strategy, a political theory, a financing mechanism, or just an acronym wearing a blazer kind of stuff? A nap is not optional. It's governance. Lately, some of that figuring out has been about gender-based violence national action plans, which of course become naps because apparently the universe has jokes. I have an entire podcast rant somewhere about acronyms and why they suck, but this is exactly the kind of thing you mean. You say naps, and suddenly half the room is thinking policy architecture, and the other half is thinking couch, blanket fort, do not disturb. So this is not a story about naps, national action plans, being boring. It's a story about what it takes to think honestly with other people in real time, when the thing you are trying to build keeps refusing to become some neat little framework just because you would very much like it to. Our first move, trying to figure out how you finance a national action plan was to take something we loved. We have this new framework for financing the prevention of gender-based violence. It's about where capital is today, where prevention sits, how movements and markets interact. So we thought, great, let's use this to read a national action plan. So we took Fiji's NAP, for example, and tried to drop its content into our GBV framework. And what we found is that our framework on financing the prevention of gender-based violence does a beautiful job of telling the story of the big picture, but it's not designed to read a NAP. It didn't help us answer the practical questions we needed, like this provision about women's sports, could that be an investable sports ecosystem versus this provision about survivor services that will always be public or philanthropic capital, probably never investment capital. And here's the distinction we were missing. A plan, these national action plans name settings. They're actually one of my favorite parts about these. I've never seen another design of a plan like this that names settings: schools, sports fields, workplaces, clinics. Settings tell you where the change has to happen and who has to make it. But then in our financial language, sectors tell you where money already moves. They're not the same list, and our frameworks kept treating them like they were. So everything came down to sounding equally financy. Trust me, suddenly churches sounded super financy, which is exactly what you don't want if you're trying to be honest about where investors belong and where they very much do not. So this realization didn't happen in the middle of one of the synthesis calls. It hit afterwards, when we actually stepped away, took a breath, took a nap, and came back to the notes. With distance, it was obvious that the GBV framework isn't wrong. It's just built for explaining the landscape, not for closely reading a NAP as a map of specific economic activities. It needed a NAP, as did we. So after we let that go, we reached for our second comfort zone, our comfy place. It's like the blanket fort for Criterion, Toolkit. We built Toolkit and the methodology. We've been teaching behind it for 12 years. It is our go-to set of tools we use all the time. It talks about 5 strategies for using finance. It breaks apart specific categories of finance. And so we thought, because it has served us so well in the past, surely we can organize NAPs using this, surely. Problem is that NAPs are incredibly specific. They name settings. They name actors like CSOs or federations or agencies. They lay out concrete actions and timelines, and our toolkit hung out with finance just a level above that. If we had tried to apply it to an actual NAP, it sort of felt like we were hovering, making interesting points, but not actually touching the decisions that governments or UN agencies or civil society organizations need to make about this line in the sand, this sector, this commitment. And so, of course, since we live in 2026, we also tried AI. We fed it the NAP text, we fed it our notes, we fed it pieces of all of these frameworks, and what it came back with was glorious, polished, high level, and honestly, so much vaguer than the hard conversation we'd be having. AI did a job. It summarized, it smoothed, it harmonized, but in doing that, it softened all of the distinctions we were trying to sharpen between services and financial assets, between moving old money and bringing in truly new capital, between costing language and actual financing structures. Again, this didn't land while we were staring at the beautiful AI output. It landed after a pause, a nap, after walking away, and then coming back and realizing this sounds good, but it doesn't actually help us to design or decide where to focus. So Toolkit and AI were useful tools, and trust us, we know we could have used AI better and try to push it a little bit farther on this, but they weren't getting us to this core framework. So another nap, another reset, and we came back at it. So one of my favorite needs a nap moment was when we started naming 5 buckets. I don't know where we were in a call, but it was the end of a design call. We were all tired. We sketched out 5 ways naps might connect to finance. 5 kind of modalities. One was net new money. The second was moving existing money more efficiently. The third was about compliance and enforcement. The fourth was a shift in future value. And the fifth was about avoiding regulatory risk today. It was rough, but it felt promising. And it was directly tied to how naps operate and what would solve for the problems that they're naming. So again, we took this scribble and turned it into a beautiful structured list. Parallel phrasing, clear headings, the sorts of thing that would look excellent in a concept note. And then we did the important step. We came back after the call with fresher eyes and a bit more energy and tried to put concrete examples under each bucket. And that's when we saw the gaps. In particular, the net new money category was honestly about our hope, but not yet honest about a pathway. We could say NAPS should attract new capital, but when we asked from whom, through what mechanism, backed by what kind of economic activity, it got blurry. That wasn't the failure of the NAP. It was a signal that our language needed to be clearer and more grounded in finance and how it actually works. Through that testing, with some breaks, some more naps, 5 became 4, because 2 of them turned out to be the same idea wearing different hats. Compliance and regulatory risk are both about changing the rules attached to money that's already moving. We had essentially listed the same bucket twice and congratulated ourselves on the symmetry. The 4 that were left finally had names. So the first was to finance the economic activity the plan names. The plan names settings, schools, sports, transport, media, whereas setting points to real economic activity in sectors, that activity can be financed. This is the clearest route to net new money. Second is to finance the implementers of the plan. Plan creates demand for services that people delivering them are not actually financially built to meet. So some receivable financing, working capital, the unglamorous plumbing that lets an organization take a contract and survive it, this moves existing money better rather than adding to it. No one has ever launched a plumbing initiative to applause. So third is we use the plan as compliance pressure and regulatory risk in investments. National action plans often change what institutions are expected to do, and expectations can be priced. Civil society already uses plans to hold governments accountable. It doesn't yet use them to hold investors accountable. Same muscle, new audience. And finally, to write an investment thesis for the future that the plan creates. If the plan works, some assets are worth more than they're priced at today. Plans almost always arrive with a costing study. They almost never arrive with an investment thesis. The 5-bucket version wasn't wasted effort. Rarely is this thinking actually wasted. It gave us language to react to. It gave us something concrete to test and refine. And then, after a nap, we could see what to keep and what to let go. So when I look back over these attempts, and it's kind of fun to run through, this was over several months, how many times we failed to figure this out. What I notice is the breakthroughs didn't happen in the moment. They happened in the space in between, when someone sat with the discomfort that this isn't quite right, even if I really want it to be. When we reread a document a few days later and said, the bullets are lovely, but they're not parallel. Or when Nemo or Sanja or Janet looked at it with fresh eyes and say, okay, this part works, but this doesn't make any sense to me. In other words, the naps weren't just a joke. Nemo's right. The pauses, the breaks, the distance, those were what allowed us to be more respectful of the national action plans themselves. Instead of forcing them into a framework that was convenient for us, we let ourselves slow down, notice where something didn't fit, and adjust. So when I say these frameworks needed a nap, what I really mean is they needed time. They needed reflection. They needed us to come back rested enough to see where we were oversimplifying and where the plan was asking more of us. And I think that's part of what it means to take national action plans seriously, because these are not lightweight documents. They're not just about compliance, but they're maps of power and possibility. Sometimes the most respectful thing we can admit is our framework isn't yet good enough. And I do believe that about our National Action Plans framework. It is not yet good enough, but it is better. And so we will again take a break, take some more naps, and try again with a clearer head.
If you believe in the power of our financial systems as a force for good, why not consider donating to Criterion Institute? Your donation enables us to stand in the face of power and ensures the power of our financial systems is directed to be a positive force against systemic injustice. Every dollar goes directly towards enabling investors and social change organisations to intervene in financial systems in bold and imaginative new ways. Find out more about the change we're creating at criterioninstitute.org/donate.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.